I'm Dan Smiley. I was asked by the Department of Environmental Quality to give this presentation. This event actually started on May 19th, and I came into it about a week later when I was contacted by Oregon DEQ to put up a virtual command post team site to help manage information. So that's how I got involved in it. I am with the Washington State Maritime Cooperative, but this work was done in a private capacity just for DEQ, just to make that clear. So this was a mystery oiling event. It started in May, on May 19th, and it had some oil tar balls washing up on the beach on Long Beach, Washington, and there were reports from the public of oiled wildlife, primarily marine birds that had been seen in the area. These reports went into Washington Department of Ecology and to the Coast Guard, and that's how this really started. There was no other information other than this. It quickly grew into a response that covered Washington and Oregon. Ultimately, it had 14 separate state and federal agencies involved. We grew to 113 responders. Over 300 miles of beach were surveyed. So you can see that this became quite an event, and really it covered the largest geographic area of any spill in the Pacific Northwest since the 1999 New Carissa event that took place off of the coast of Oregon near Coos Bay. There were some significant challenges based on the time of year and other events that were taking place in the state. This was the Rose Festival week. It was Fleet Week in Portland. It was the holiday weekend. Multiple states were involved, and a key stumbling block that wasn't readily apparent at first was the lack of a responsible party. You know, when we drill for these kinds of events, when we train for these kinds of events, when we're working with agencies in these kinds of events, primarily we are regulating a responsible party who has an oil spill plan, who has certificates of financial responsibility, and is ready to mobilize. And without that in place, there are some hurdles to overcome. I can find where my cursor has disappeared to here. There we go. So some key response actions that took place in this event. A unified command was formed. It was initially the U.S. Coast Guard and the Department of Ecology in Washington, because it started off as just a Washington event. It was oil on Long Beach. And the oil began to spread south quite quickly. And so within 3 or 4 days, we had oil on Cannon Beach in Oregon. And so the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality ended up joining the Unified Command. The incident had a really strong wildlife response. And one of the key lessons learned here, or hurdles, was dealing with wildlife on the Washington side of the border and on the Oregon side of the border. In Washington, Focus Wildlife was activated. Hi, Jenny, I saw you logged in there. Nice to see you. Focus Wildlife was mobilized. They did the recon and the capture, and they made a decision to do the rehab and cleaning at their fixed facility in Anacortes, Washington. And anybody who hasn't had an opportunity to go up there and take a tour I'm sure Focus would be thrilled to have you. It's nice to see how prepared they are to accept these animals when the need arises. But then there's the difficulty of transporting these animals from the coast to the Anacortes facility. So there's some logistics challenges there. Because of the fear of avian flu, a decision was made that these animals could not be transported from Oregon to the Anacortes facility in Washington state. And so separate arrangements were made to decon and rehab these animals at a facility in Astoria, Oregon. These pieces of the response were really treated as two separate wildlife branches operating in the two different states, which kind of flies in the face of a unified response. And I think that's going to be a theme that we come across as we look at this effort throughout the various things that took place. A lot of work was done on the federal side to identify where this oil was. The Coast Guard mobilized for aerial observation. They took the lead in that regard. They had Oregon DEQ and Washington and wildlife folks on board to do that overflight. One of the key things they were looking for was a source of this oil. And although there was a vessel of interest that was identified early on based on AIS data, that never really materialized as something that could be proved. And so even to this day, there is no source for this oil. NOAA did come out and do some oil spill trajectories. They were able to identify some offshore oil that they were able to plug into the NOAA model and give some idea of the kinds of impacts that we might expect going forward. And so with that, SCAT teams were mobilized, primarily led by the Coast Guard, to survey beaches in both Washington and Oregon. This was a massive effort, led, like I said, by the Coast Guard, but including Department of Ecology, Oregon DEQ, Fish and Wildlife, Oregon Parks. And I think in one of the earlier presentations, it was mentioned that all of the beaches in Oregon are public and they're all managed by I may get this wrong, but by Oregon Parks. And so they're the agency with jurisdiction, and were really critical in being part of those SCAT teams. So I think there's some lessons learned going on within, Oregon about who's involved and how we form up these SCAT teams, because it hadn't really been an issue up to then. 427 SCAT reports that were generated, over 300 miles of beaches that were surveyed. Oregon used a tool that is part of the Esri GIS suite called Survey 123 to be their SCAT data collection tool. And that allowed them to roll that information into the common operating picture that was being managed by DEQ. And I've got to say that the DEQ, the Oregon common operating picture model, is really a superior tool. They have been working with us in industry for a long time and joining in some of our exercises and training. Industries provided them ideas, they've provided us ideas, and at this point, it is a really excellent tool. So well done, guys. So a lot went on in SCAT and getting that information up into a common operating picture to make it actionable for operations. And operations was led by the Coast Guard. Again, there was no responsible party. So the Coast Guard took the lead as the operations section chief. They took the lead as the planning section chief, filled many of the high-level ICS positions throughout the response. 36 miles of beaches in Washington and Oregon were cleaned, over 2,000 pounds of oiled debris. And it was a challenging cleanup in that it covered a lot of area, but the actual uh, car patty sizes were pretty small. And so they were kind of all over the place and required a kind of a focused effort to find all these bits of contamination and get them bagged up. It also led to a large discussion as to how clean is clean, and it would normally be a discussion that was originated by the responsible party and then evaluated by agencies. But without a responsible party to kind of drive that issue, it probably stretched out over a longer period of time than was necessary. Here's an example of some of the debris that was caught up in this. I think one of the bigger things to point out from this response was the use of the virtual command post. And that's because there were so many people involved across what was ultimately 3 states. California OSPR joined on day 12 or 13, as it looked like the oil might get that far south. But there was no physical command post. And you go to Clean Gulf and you go to Clean Pacific, and you talk about whether the virtual command posts that were developed during the COVID pandemic are here to stay or not. And the answer is quite clearly yes. They're here to stay. We are all defaulting to this method of management. And as a result, I think some more work needs to be done to make sure that a team, no matter what platform you want to use, is spun up, warmed up, and ready to go when these kinds of incidents take place. There were over 120 participants in the virtual command post from all kinds of agencies. The Coast Guard got in using other than their .mil addresses. It was a bit of a challenge to make it accessible to everyone. Some security rules were probably broken in order to open it all the way up for everybody. But in the end, everybody got the access that they needed. One of the big challenges when you're working with a virtual command post and unified command in 3 different states is, how do you approve plans? How do you get signatures? And so we use DocuSign as the method for packaging up these plans and getting them out to the unified command for signature. And we've used DocuSign now for several large worst case tabletop exercises as well. But working on a process for who owns this, I think it belongs in the documentation unit. But who owns this? How do you do it? Training with some method for getting remote signatures in the past is probably time well spent. I'll spend some time talking about the liaison and PIO functions, because this was a big deal. There was a lot of impact over a holiday weekend. Cannon Beach sees tens of thousands of people on these holidays, and people who have planned celebrations. In Oregon alone, within the designated hot zone, there were 154 permitted weddings, meaning that they were over 50 guests, so they required a state or a county permit to put on the event. So 54 of these large events that happened within the hot zone. People, you couldn't close the beach. There was just enough oil to cause the problem, and just not quite enough to justify closing down the beach, which led to a pickle. Oregon and Washington did a great job. Here's an example of one of their situation flyers. These were put out on the beaches along with some wildlife information. Bravo to the use of the QR code so that people could, scan and get more information and make reports for observed oil. They ran a dedicated website for this event. There was a massive social media program, all coordinated across these two states over teams, and it was not an easy thing to do. The event lasted almost 3 weeks when it was finally decided that they had gotten everything that needed to be cleaned up. There is an after-action report that is in the possession of Oregon DEQ, that if people haven't read it, they can get a hold of it. A couple of the recommendations that came out of this was to establish a unified environmental unit across jurisdictions. And this comes back to what I was saying about the wildlife branch. The response seemed to just naturally divide itself at the Columbia River. And that meant that there was a wildlife branch working on the Washington side, a wildlife branch working on the Oregon side. There was an EU on the Washington side, an EU on the Oregon side. They were communicating, but they really weren't single units as you might expect with the incident command system. And so making sure that that when we're working in ICS, that we're working in a single response, I think is worth reiterating. And then developing scalable survey and response strategies for shoreline oiling came up as a standout. And, Oregon started with Survey 123. They've developed a really good process there. They've gone farther since this event ended. I know that they've expanded this into the safety realm so that they can use Survey 123 to capture safety information, incidents and accidents, and communicate that back to the command posts. So as was mentioned in one of the other presentations, there's a lot of great technology that people are trying to bring to bear on these problems. And when we do stuff like the Washington's BAP conference, the best achievable, I forget what that means, whatever, technology. Yeah, that's it, technology. Bringing all these together so that we can all start to work on the same kinds of technology, I think would be really useful. This was a mystery spill, and it's going to happen again. In the 2022 Oil in the Sea report that came out, they recognized 237 large sunken vessels in North America, and that represents over 600,000 to 6 million barrels of oil. There have been a number of these vessels that have let go over the years, one off the coast of San Francisco. I know that when the CAN-US PAC exercise was being planned for this year, there was a lot of talk about historic wrecks and mystery oil. So there's going to be another event that is not going to have a responsible party, that is going to require a rapid agency response. And hopefully some planning is going on to make that a smooth event. That's certainly not everything that could possibly be talked about. It was a pretty big event. I'm sure many of you were in this response and have your own lessons learned. But with that, I'll pause and take some comments or questions.